I'm Cierra Bettens. Welcome to APTN News InFocus. This week, we're putting policing in focus. In the final months of 2024, 15 Indigenous people died while interacting with police in Canada. Some were shot, others beaten to death. Some were run over by police cruisers. Their deaths renewed calls for a national inquiry into systemic racism in policing. And that is a topic of a 3-part series on APTN Investigates called Inside Policing. Tamara Pimentel, Rob Smith, and Tom Fennario are the reporters behind these stories, and they join us now. Thanks so much for joining us. So, Tamara, I'm going to start with you. Here's a little bit from your episode, Deadly Force.
He should still be here, living his dreams, his goals. Because what they did to him wasn't okay. They shouldn't have done what they did to him.
So, Tamara, I'm curious to know what prompted you to start this investigation?
Yeah, so Deadly Force is sort of a recap on what happened last year, and it's kind of the episode that prompted the whole Inside Policing series to begin with. Last year, between end of August and mid-December, 15 Indigenous people were killed either during police interactions or while in custody, and that sparked outrage across the country. There were many calls for a national inquiry from the AFN, from families, from Indigenous leadership. It prompted an emergency debate in the House of Commons. So it was kind of a long build-up for these calls. And so from there, we decided to do this Inside Policing story. Deadly Force, we speak with some of the families and we speak with sort of experts on what needs to change within the police force across the country.
Mm-hmm. And I'm also wondering, where did you travel for this story and who are some of the main characters that we hear from?
So we actually traveled to a few places in Alberta. We start on the Blood Reserve in southern Alberta, about 2 hours south of Calgary, and we spoke with the family of John Wells. John Wells was 42. He was in Calgary at a hotel, and hotel staff had asked him to leave, called police. An interaction happened, and he was actually tased and beat by 3 different police officers. And from there, EMS was called, sedated him while he was restrained, and moments later, he was found deceased at the scene. Edith Wells is his mother. She is one of the people that we speak with, and she was one of the mothers that went to Ottawa demanding for a national inquiry. From there, I traveled north to Wetaskiwin, where we heard from Natalie Lightning. She's the grandmother of 15-year-old Hoss Lightning Saddleback, who was shot and killed by a Wetaskiwin RCMP after he called for help. He said he was being followed, that he felt like he was unsafe. And when they arrived, an altercation broke out and they ended up shooting him. And he was only 15 years old. So his death, I think, really, really sat with people, and it was very close to home. And there was so many protests across the country following the death of Hoss Lightning Saddleback.
Thanks for that, Tamara. So, Tom, I'm going to go to you now. Your episode is called Essential Service. So let's hear a bit from that episode.
I absolutely understand why people are frustrated. I mean, there has not been enough police presence in this community. You know, I don't feel like we are adequately serving our communities because we don't have enough bodies to work 24/7. It's not fair to the communities that we police, and it's not fair to the officers. I mean, you could basically work around the clock if you wanted. It's not really healthy for the officers to be operating like that. And I mean, I know some officers that do.
So it sounds like Indigenous police forces across the country are being overwhelmed by the drug crisis and crime rates. How are they coping?
Not very well, because at the core of it, they are drastically underfunded. And what I'm stating here is not really opinion. It's pretty much acknowledged that the way we fund First Nations, or Indigenous police forces, I should say, is broken. And this has been acknowledged by the federal government for a long time, and they've been trying to fix it by making Indigenous policing an essential service. But it's taken 3 years, and it hasn't really gotten anywhere. So that's what my story explores, and also explores the personal cost of what it's like to have only 3 police officers to police a community that's dealing with all of these crises. They're not able to provide a 24-hour service, and they certainly need one in some of these communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, you mentioned that we hear a lot of talk about the federal government talking about First Nations policing being an essential service. And I'm wondering, sort of where is that issue now and what's changed over the last couple of years?
Right now, it's in total limbo, partly because of the politics of the day. Our listeners likely know we have a new prime minister. We also have a new minister of public safety. So this issue is going to be in total purgatory until the next election. That being said, the legislation has been stalled for a while over squabbles over sovereignty. So First Nations, as you can imagine, would like to keep their sovereignty or have sovereignty over how their communities are policed. And the main issue, as my story delves into, as we've found through documents, internal documents, shows that basically the provinces are pushing back against the idea of First Nation sovereignty over their own policing. And that's where the big hang-up is. So this legislation isn't likely to get done until there's something settled at that impasse. And what essential service legislation does is it sort of allows First Nations policing to not have to worry so much about, having an agreement re-signed every few years, about having decisions made for them about what they need and how they need it. It'll give them more power to tell the powers that be, the provinces and the feds who share the funding, I should say, this is what we need, and this is how we need to do it because we're the ones on the ground, and these are our communities.
All right, thanks for that, Tom. So now I'm going to turn to Rob Smith in Vancouver. So your episode is called Watching the Watchers. Let's hear a clip from that.
One of the most difficult things from that day was seeing the youth being hurt, and then when they were safe in camp, but when the police came, they ran out to protect me, and 2 young people were arrested with me and thrown down on the ground with me and surrounded by security and construction workers with me, and that was, that's something I just really still chokes me up, is just thinking about those young youth running to save me, and there was all these men there. And that they may possibly go to jail, and that they lived most of their life in the foster care system. They already served.
And so, Rob, your story will wrap up the series. Can you tell us a bit about it?
The pitch went this way. Like, for more than 2 decades, Indigenous people who are standing up for their Indigenous rights out there in the land have felt the full force of the state, fall down on them. From frontline clashes to with specialized RCMP units to being watched by the Canadian intelligence services. So we're going to kind of delve into exactly what that meant. What were these units that were set up? Why were they set up? And how they've interacted on the front lines there. My story is going to be told through the eyes of a couple of the tiny house warriors, twin sisters, Kanhus and Mayuk Manuel, who've put themselves out there in the front lines for the past 2 decades in a number of different Indigenous rights fights. I remember meeting them first 25 years ago, I think. It was at a protest at Sun Peaks ski resort. They've been fighting this fight, going to jail, being arrested for 2 decades now. They're part of a lineage, a family lineage that includes their grandfather, George Manuel, who was a well-known leader in the 70s. Their father, Art, who's a scholar and author. And so my story will kind of look at this ongoing fight that's generations long through this family.
Something, we've heard a lot of people talk about in our stories and, just on the topic of police accountability is, we have things like the Alberta Serious Incident Response Team, the Manitoba Independent Investigations Unit, and the RCMP's Civilian Review and Complaints Commission, and how long it takes for complaints to be investigated and reviewed through those channels. What can you tell us about, what is the holdup with that?
It is a long process. We reached out to the federal RCMP watchdog. They currently have a systemic investigation going on one of the units known as CERG or KERG. That's one of the units that's very active here in BC. You've seen them on the news with the Wet'suwet'en standoff, and also the Tiny House Warriors. Kenny Manuel has a personal civil suit against one of the officers in that KERG unit. It's just the way things are set up. Talking with the complaints commissioner just recently, they promise something by the end of this year on that ongoing systemic investigation into KERG.
All right. Well, thanks for that, Rob. So to wrap up, I'm going to ask you each the same question. So what did you take away from the episode that you investigated and produced? I'll start with you, Tamara.
Yeah, so every single person that I've reached out to when, I told them I was doing this story, I was trying to look for interviews. I was reaching out to current police. I was reaching out to former police officers, to families. And the number one thing that always came up was, what is the training that these police officers are getting before they're being sent to communities? So that is one thing that I do talk about in the episode, and something that I've learned quite a bit about. We'll learn more about that when it airs, what's some of the training that's been happening.
I guess one thing, my major takeaway is that obviously if we're going to address the root causes of drug abuse and violence in certain communities, then we're going to have to address intergenerational trauma from colonialism. But before that gets done, we're going to need policing, adequate policing in First Nations communities. And it appears that when it works well. And the model, when it does work well, is more on a community policing approach. And but you can't do community policing if you don't have feet on the ground, if you're too busy just trying to survive day to day, if you're not even there when people need you, right? So that's the main takeaway is community policing is a good solution for the time being until we can solve these major issues, and it needs to be properly funded.
For me, I was struck by just the more things change, the more they stay the same. I think by focusing on this family that's been doing this same thing over and over again for years and years, it just seems to be the same story. And it's almost existential for me at this point. What are we even doing here? And you do get a sense of the dedication it takes when you talk to the sisters, and they're not willing to give up on what they believe is their land. And so these types of interactions with the state, I guess, will continue until, that question, that fundamental root question of who owns the land is finally answered. So I think that's what I take away from it.
All right, well, Tom, Tamara, Rob, thanks so much for joining us. Really excited to watch the new 3-part series on APTN Investigates Inside Policing, of which each of you have produced in episode 4. So yeah, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Police and journalists are also coming into contact more and more these days. Clayton Reimers, the executive director of Reporters Without Borders North America, has said, quote, "A malicious pattern is emerging in Canada. Reporters go into the field to cover protests or police action, then are swept up indiscriminately as police arrest demonstrators," unquote. A number of journalists have been arrested for covering stories, like the RCMP raids on Wet'suwet'en territory. Before she started at APTN, reporter Savanna Craig was arrested for covering a pro-Palestinian protest in Montreal. Savanna joins us now to share more about her experience. Thanks so much for joining us, Savanna.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm wondering, to start off, can you take us back to the day that you were arrested? What happened?
Yeah, so I was arrested on April 15th, 2024. I was covering a pro-Palestine protest that was happening in a bank, specifically Scotiabank, the headquarters of Scotiabank in downtown Montreal. And protesters were essentially demonstrating in this bank because Scotiabank invests in Elbit Systems, which is an Israeli defense contractor. And what activists had done is they had lined themselves up in front of the bank teller desks as well as the ATM. What they explained to me is they did this to sort of disrupt any sort of transactions or any use of this bank, to sort of economically impact them in order to apply pressure for Scotiabank to divest from Elbit Systems. And not long after I had arrived, what I assume, because I saw the tellers on the phone, is that they were calling the police. And maybe 30 minutes after, roughly, the police came in. And they didn't announce arrests right away, but they essentially formed a line in front of the protesters, and they later announced arrests. It was 44 activists that were arrested. The media that was covering this demonstration at the time said it was 45, but they did not know that there was a journalist inside. And I was included with the activists, and I was arrested as well. Despite identifying myself as a journalist multiple times and showing my press pass, the police decided to carry out with my arrest.
And so what were you charged with?
I had criminal charges of mischief. Essentially, these charges are usually put forth due to, some sort of public disobedience. These charges can carry a maximum jail sentence of 2 years and a fine of up to $5,000 Canadian. And someone with mischief charges can if it's put forth, it can also restrict them from leaving the country.
Wow. Yes, I'm wondering, after this, what ended up happening in the end? And, how has this impacted you as a journalist?
Yeah. So it wasn't until mid-October, actually a week before I started at APTN, that I was called by an officer, and they let me know that the Crown had decided to not follow through with my charges. A difference here in Quebec from some other provinces is that police can only suggest charges, and then it's essentially up to the prosecution of whether they want to carry out these charges or not. So it was decided by the prosecution, I guess with the evidence put forth that I was a journalist, they decided not to charge me. I guess how it's impacted me, I have been keeping an eye on press freedom violations for quite a long time now. Actually, specifically since 2016, when journalist Justin Brake was arrested and had both civil and criminal charges against his coverage of the Muskrat Falls hydro project. And since then, you know, I saw that situation. I saw what happened in Wet'suwet'en, and, you know, I just kind of knew that this was a reality, not only for any journalist, but specifically for journalists covering these types of protests. And I guess I wouldn't say, in terms of how it's impacted me, I think the thing with arrests and any type of police intimidation towards journalists is it kind of sends this message, you know, don't cover this or else this could happen to you. But I continued, you know, at the time covering pro-Palestine protests and the sort of effects here in Montreal and in Canada to what's been happening in the Middle East. That was my beat at the time. It really didn't affect me feeling prevented from going to these protests and continuing to do my job. You know, I continued up until I started at APTN, but it does send that message, and not only to the journalists who have been arrested, that this is a continued risk, but to other journalists. So in terms of impact, I wouldn't say that it stopped me in any way, but it was just sort of a reminder that press freedoms aren't a reality in Canada.
Mm-hmm. And so, you know, you mentioned that you've been following these cases of press freedom violations for quite some time. But I'm wondering, what have you observed about cases of other journalists who have been arrested on the job? And do you see any similarities between your case and other cases of this?
Absolutely. There are definitely a lot of similarities. You know, Justin Brake is one. He was covering an Indigenous-led protest of a hydro project in Muskrat Falls in 2016. There was Jerome Turner, Amber Bracken, Michael Toledano, who were arrested for covering Wet'suwet'en protests in 2021. And specifically with Amber and Michael, they were actually held in detention for 2 days, sort of a punitive style detention where the lights were left on, you know, all day, all night. They were denied access to soap, a toothbrush. Those were particularly rough cases, but the common similarity between all of these is that not only are they Indigenous-led protests, but they were protests where there wasn't heavy media presence on the scene. And I think that's important to note because it just sort of gives that opportunity for journalists to be targeted, to be silenced. And in the case of Jerome Turner, he was working for Ricochet Media at the time for when he was covering the Wet'suwet'en protests. And, you know, this is not a huge media outlet. Just the same with me. I wasn't working with a huge media outlet. And I think that sometimes there can be this sort of impression that if you're not there with this big satellite truck, with this big camera, you know, maybe you're not wearing sort of like a pantsuit, you're not a journalist. But I don't think there's any specific way for a journalist to look to prove they're a journalist. We're just there to document the truth and show to our audience what's going on. So I think it is really alarming that there is this common similarity. And, you know, if it continues to happen, I think it's going to deter other journalists from feeling like they can go cover these types of events. And I think it's also really important that, you know, not only that we show the truth of what's happening, especially as so many assumptions can be made on a protest, on a situation when we're not at the scene, but also, you know, such as my case, such as with Justin Brake and the coverage of Wet'suwet'en, it's really important for us to be there to document how arrests are carried out. You know, if there's abuse of power by the police, it's only the protester's word and the police's word. We're the unbiased presence to report the truth. So we need to be there to show these protests, show how these arrests are being carried out.
And I guess, you know, a bigger question is, what threat does the arrest of journalists doing their job pose to the freedom of the press and democracy in Canada?
Mm-hmm. It poses a threat that journalists are not safe to do their job freely. I think that there's two issues at hand where police may not be having proper media literacy skills. In the case of the Montreal police, they don't actually have training in schools or continued training within the police force towards media literacy. And this is an issue because this is where that kind of circumstance can arise where an individual police officer is deciding who's media and who's not. And for me, I thought a press pass was enough to determine that I was a journalist. I was there on assignment, but that wasn't enough. And I think that it's a mix of lack of media literacy, but I think it's also an attempt to silence journalists because, if we are there, they have to be cautious of how they carry out arrests. And there have been circumstances in the past where police don't carry out arrests lawfully. And when we're there to document that, there can be retribution. This can be broadcasted to our audiences and people find out about this abuse of power. So I think it's definitely a mix of lack of media literacy, but also an attempt to silence us. And that's really alarming for the current state of press freedoms, but also the future of press freedoms, because I think that many journalists are doing the work to speak out against what's happening, but it's not stopping. Just this weekend here in Montreal, there was a journalist who was covering the annual police brutality march. And there were two circumstances within that march where they were targeted by police and they were pushed to the ground. And in a situation where they were taking photos within the metro of the protests, the police again was pushing them back, telling them, "You're not media, you're freelance." Even though this journalist was working for the Link newspaper, which is a publication at Concordia University, whether they're a freelancer or not, it's not up to this cop to determine what's a journalist or not. They had a press pass. They told the cop they had a press pass. And this is really alarming. And I think as well, we're not seeing any response from many politicians. At the time of my arrest, Justin Trudeau didn't say anything. At the time of Justin Brake or Amber Bracken, Michael Toledano, Jerome Turner, Justin Trudeau didn't say anything. But these same politicians are willing to speak out against the silencing of press freedoms in other countries, but they're not willing to speak out against the situation in their own country. And we really need that political support to not only condemn what's happened, but prevent it from continuing. As I mentioned before, so many great journalists are doing the work to bring this to the public's attention. Even in my case, so many people were surprised that this happened to me. And I had so many people tell me, I didn't know things like this happen in Canada where journalists get arrested. They have these types of experiences. And, I just kind of listed out so many examples, but that's the issue. We're seeing this become a trend and so many people are in the dark about it. They don't know the reality of it, as well as so many people who have the power to stop this. They're not putting in the work. They're not calling this out. And it's just, in my opinion, it's going to continue and it's going to get worse. And, we really need to be able to do our jobs without being threatened.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your experiences, Savanna. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
You can follow Savanna's stories by tuning into APTN National News at 6 p.m. Eastern. Deadly Force, the first episode in APTN Investigates' 3-part Inside Policing series, premieres this Saturday, March 22nd at 6:30 p.m. Eastern on APTN. You can learn more about the series on aptnnews.ca/Inside Policing. This episode of InFocus was produced by Mark Blackburn and Charmaine Straker, with editing by Jesse Andrushko, and hosted by me, Cierra Bettens. If you're enjoying the show, let us know by leaving a rating and review. You can find more APTN podcasts like APTN News Brief and Truth in Politics on aptnnews.ca/podcasts or on your favorite player. Thanks for listening.
Hi, I'm Dennis Ward, one of the hosts of APTN National News. We've expanded our Truth in Politics panel into a weekly podcast. Each episode, panelists Jennifer Leywitz and Negon Sinclair join us to examine key issues affecting Indigenous peoples across Canada. Listen and subscribe on your favorite podcast player.